Good morning. We got a ton of stories this week, so let's get going. The first story is Biden and team are thinking big on offshore wind, targeting 30 gigawatts. That's 30,000 megawatts, which is actually close to what various East Coast states have already set as their targets and legislative mandates. And speaking of those things, Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker just signed an aggressive climate bill here in Massachusetts focusing on improvements in appliances, also more efficient buildings, and a focus on environmental justice, and finally an increase in targeted offshore wind, jumping from 3,200 megawatts to 5,600 megawatts. And the U.S. isn't the only one eyeing offshore wind. In the U.K., Britain's Crown Estate, which has the right to lease offshore, said last week it's developing a new leasing round for floating wind projects in the Celtic Sea. These floating projects cost more as they're in deeper water where fixed structures can't make it, and they use novel technologies. But costs will fall as more projects come online, and this will eventually be the new wind frontier, not just in Europe, but west coast of the United States and parts of Asia as well. The Biden administration is not only targeting wind, it's also looking at a 60% reduction in solar costs over the coming decade, shooting at 3 cents per kilowatt hour, so $30 a megawatt hour by 2025, and 2 cents by 2030. This effort will include $128 million in R&D, including $40 million for that promising technology, perovskite, that has enticed researchers for years. So as these costs come down, especially solar costs, they'll become a more attractive option in sun-drenched areas of the country like California and Nevada. And speaking of Nevada, its Public Utilities Commission just approved a nearly 600-mile transmission project from NV Energy, a $2.5 billion GreenLink project aimed at supporting the expansion of renewables, both in-state and integration with out-of-state. The project is expected to catalyze as much as 5 gigawatts of in-state renewables. Transmission certainly helps with the integration of those resources, and so do batteries. And Australia is going great guns in that area, especially behind the meter supporting rooftop solar. The country installed over 31,000 battery systems last year, up 20% from 2019, and now reaching a cumulative total of almost 110,000 installations in the country. Most of those systems are your typical 4-hour lithium-ion installations, but we'll need longer duration storage technologies as we see increasingly larger amounts of renewables coming into our grid mixes. For that reason, the U.S. Department of Energy recently launched its $75 million Grid Storage Launchpad facility located at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory in Washington State. The facility, to start construction this year, will be fully ready by 2025. It will boast 30 research labs, including testing chambers for assessing prototypes and grid energy storage technologies under real-world grid operating conditions. One other thing we found out recently about renewables and batteries, they can black start grids. The Imperial Valley Irrigation District proved this a few years ago, where it tested lithium-ion batteries and jump-starting its grid after a blackout that was planned. But the National Renewable Energy Laboratory proved this year it could work in the real world in an unplanned event. They'd staged a test, but then a real blackout occurred when a transformer blew up on their flat iron grid. The initial plan was to wait for a diesel genset to be brought in, but the researchers said, why don't we test this concept we were working on? They worried that a power grid with more than 80% renewables, such as characterizes the flat iron grid at NREL, could behave differently during a black start, since no one had tried anything quite like that before. So even when that diesel genset arrived, they decided not to use it, and they spent about 10 days developing an approach which went as follows. Start with smaller batteries to recharge the local grid lithium-ion battery, the grid scale one, and then when they finally got enough juice, turn on the computers in the control room, which then allowed them to restart the solar array and eventually the wind turbines when the wind showed up a couple days later. They're still analyzing the data, but the good news is this thing worked, and it will help them develop a blueprint for using renewables to rebound from outages related to bad weather, cyber attack, or equipment failures. As we move into a more inverter-based grid with these renewable resources, understanding how all of this can come together and rely on those inverters to integrate in and black start these grids is going to be critical for maintaining and safeguarding our grids of the future. Well, thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.